Welcome to our study of Daniel chapter 8. My name is Bob Pulliam and I'm the evangelist for the Charlotte Church of Christ. We meet at 5327 South Tryon Street in Charlotte, North Carolina. We hope that you can come and worship with us, and perhaps we can sit down and study the Bible together. Now, Daniel chapter 8, I've given it the title, The Beginning of Tribulations. And as we look at verses 3 through 14 of this chapter, we have a vision that is given to Daniel. And in this vision we see a ram and we see a shaggy goat. And these are going to represent kingdoms. And what's happening in this chapter is we are being given additional information to what we received back in chapter 7 and also in chapter 2. There we have 4 kingdoms prophesied for us, but we don't really have any detail about those kingdoms presented to us. So here in chapter 8, we're kind of zeroing in on the second and the third kingdoms of those 2 prophecies in chapter 2 and chapter 7. And that therefore must surround the Medo-Persian Empire and the Macedonian or the Grecian Empire. And what's going to happen in chapter 8 here is we're going to come down to these 2 kingdoms, but then we're going to focus on that third kingdom, and we're going to see details about the Grecian Empire that will be fulfilled in great detail. And then later on in the book, we're actually going to be given even more information about the close of the Grecian Empire, and we're going to see the coming of the Roman Empire and a few details from the beginning of that empire. Now, the primary detail to understand is that these are the 2 kingdoms being described. Some of the times as we come to the end of the book of Daniel, people like to try to see other things coming into play. And what they will most notably do is they will jump way off into our future and try to see something about the end times. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that as we go on in this particular chapter. Now the main details, as I mentioned, we have 2 creatures here. We have a ram and we have a shaggy goat. The ram has 2 horns, and these 2 horns indicate the dichotomy of this one kingdom of the Medes on the one hand and the Persians on the other hand. And the ram is butting against the world, and no one can stand against him. But here comes the shaggy goat. And in verses 20 and 21 we have these 2 creatures interpreted for us. And we see when we get the shaggy goat that he is moving in verse 5 across the entire earth without touching the ground, and he has a conspicuous horn between his eyes. This is a very, very apt description of the conquests of Alexander the Great. And here comes Alexander in a very swift manner. He comes up against warring tribes and the Persians, and he defeats them all. Within a matter of 4 years, he has conquered the world. This takes us from 336 to 332 BC. So now we have the Grecian Empire, and it is going to rule the world. Now, there is an interesting detail here that I want to focus on right here at this point, and then I'm going to bring it up again at the end of our study, because there's some language in Daniel that you have to be very, very careful with. And so let's go to verse 19. I'd like for you to read that with me. Gabriel here is interpreting the vision for Daniel. And so Gabriel says to Daniel, "Behold, I'm going to let you know what will occur at the final period of the indignation, for it pertains to the appointed time of the end." Well, we've got the appointed time of the end here. Verse 17, he also speaks of, at the end of that verse, the vision pertains to the time of the end. Well, the times of the Greeks, of the Medo-Persian and then the Grecian Empire, were coming to the time of the end. Now, he can't be talking about the end of the world. If he were talking about the end of the world, then we wouldn't be here. The world would have ended at that sometime there, at that time of the period of the Greeks or shortly thereafter. And so the time of the end is in there, but that's not what it is. He's also not talking about the end times that you hear preachers talking about, televangelists and book writers. We're in this end times craze right now in religion today. And there are things that have been misunderstood about the Bible. I'm not saying that anyone is intentionally misrepresenting the Bible, but just because you believe what you teach doesn't necessarily mean that you are teaching the truth. And the truth of the matter here is that there are things in the book of Daniel that are said to be way off in our future because they are the end, the time of the end. And yet you have to define what end you're actually talking about when you use the word end. And that's being defined here in Daniel, and we're going to see that. So what we're going to learn here in Daniel chapter 8 is we're going to be given more detail about the second and third kingdoms of the visions in chapter 2 and chapter 7, which is the Medo-Persian Empire and the Grecian Empire. When we come to chapter 9, we're going to focus in on the timeline, giving the timing for the coming of the Messiah's kingdom, and that's going to take us through the Grecian Empire into the Roman Empire. Then in chapters 10 through 12, we're going to be given a lot of detail about the Grecian Empire and the beginning of the Roman Empire and the coming of the Messiah and the destruction of Jerusalem. And these are all end times, but what end times? Well, people want to make it refer to something in our future, and that sounds good and it's very, very appealing to people, but the problem is that's not what Daniel's dealing with. Daniel is dealing with a different end times. And we're going to talk about that as we go on in the book of Daniel. And I'm going to emphasize this again at the end of this study of Daniel chapter 8. Now, as we look at the events going on here, we have the shaggy goat with the large horn between his eyes, and that large horn represents Alexander the Great, as we've already noted. The picture, the description is just, it's irrefutable from the standpoint of Bible interpretation. The angel says that it defeats the Medo-Persians. We've got the king here represented by the horn, and so that's Alexander the Great. Just look at the fulfillment. But then we find that the large horn is broken. And when the large horn is broken, 4 smaller horns come up in its place. Now, these smaller horns are the kings that are going to come after Alexander the Great. They are his successors. And so you have in verse 22 of Daniel 8, the broken horn and the 4 horns that arose in its place represent 4 kingdoms which will arise from his nation. So when Alexander the Great dies, we should expect somewhere in history to see 4 kingdoms then arise out of that. And so it's not that the Grecian Empire will continue as one whole, but instead it's going to be divided up, and the Grecians are going to rule in individual kingdoms. And that is in fact what we see happening. When Alexander the Great dies, he had appointed no successor. In fact, the report is that when before he died, he was asked, "Who will succeed you?" You can imagine his generals and bodyguards all standing around his bed and just on bated breath. They're waiting for him to name them. And all he says is, the strongest one. Well, that left it open. Everybody thinks they're the strongest one. So when Alexander does die, his bodyguards, his generals, his viceroy back in Greece, his son, they're all going to be vying for this vast empire that he has left without naming a successor. And there were a number of men who took a stab at trying to consolidate everything. It's a very, very interesting story as they tried to gain control. But when the dust had all cleared, we find that the kingdom was divided up into 4 parts, the 4 horns. And so we have 4 parts. 2 of those parts went to 2 of the bodyguards. Lysimachus and Ptolemy were 2 of his bodyguards. They held a great deal of influence with soldiers. They were able to amass some force, and so they were able to wrest some power out of all of this. As the dust continues to clear, of course, Seleucus is going to take some because he was commander of the infantry. And then Alexander's trusted viceroy in Macedon, Antipater, he of course is back in Greece, and he gets the word, and so he's able to grab up some of this. But Antipater is an old man. He's already in his late 70s when all of this happens, and he's not going to be able to rule long anyway. So what he has gotten, he gives to Alexander's son, Cassander, and Cassander then is going to have a small portion of the Grecian Empire. So we have it then divided up into 4 parts, and two of these kingdoms that arises, they're going to be dominant in all of this, as we're going to see in chapter 11. We're going to have the Ptolemies down in Egypt, and we're going to have the Seleucids up in the area of Syria. And these two are going to become the northern and the southern kingdoms of chapter 11, and they are going to do battle with each other. Now, the small horn that arises, one of the 4 horns in the vision, is broken, and one small horn comes up in its place. And we're told that small horn, just in the prophecy itself in chapter 9, and out of one of them came forth a rather small horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the beautiful land. In other words, the Holy Land, the land that Israel had possessed, being promised to Abraham. This one that arises, as we see the descriptions and we look back at history, there really can't be any doubt that this is Antiochus IV Epiphanes. And Antiochus Epiphanes fits the bill exactly as this small horn is described here in chapter 8. We're gonna learn more about him in chapter 11. But he is described here, just going back into the vision itself and using the words of the vision, and that is that in verse 12, well, back in verse 11, that horn even magnified itself to be equal with the commander of the host, and it removed the regular sacrifice from him, and the place of his sanctuary was thrown down. And so we have the sacrifices being disavowed by this ruler, and they are ceased. We're told the length of time in verse 14, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the holy place will be properly restored. This seems to be referred to in 1 Maccabees 6 in verse 16. We do know that Antiochus Epiphanes came in, he defiled the altar and would not allow sacrifices, and the 2,300 evenings and mornings, that comes to roughly over 6 years in time, and that would line up with what we have in history with regard to that period of time. From 171 BC to 164 BC, we have the sacrifices ceasing, and then the altar being rededicated and everything put back the way it was before. And so here we have a prophecy that gives a lot of detail, not just about what's going to happen with these kingdoms, the Grecian Empire, but is specific with regard to talking about persecution of God's people. And these are the beginnings of tribulations. There are tribulations that are coming against the Jews. Their regular sacrifices will be ceased, and there will be a beginning of tribulations. In verse 25, we have a description of the end of this man that we know as Antiochus Epiphanes. Josephus actually tells us, the Roman historian, well, he's a Jewish historian, but well, we won't go into his political allegiances. But Josephus, the historian, he tells us about the death of Antiochus Epiphanes, and it accords with what we have in verse 25 with regard to the end of Antiochus Epiphanes. Daniel is then told that the vision of the evenings and the mornings, which has been told, is true. Keep the vision secret, for it pertains to many days in the future. When it's a long way off in prophecy, the prophet is told, keep it to yourself. When it's just a short time, it's let it be known. For example, in the book of Revelation, the time is at hand, the time is short. Do not seal up the words of the prophecy of this book. And so it wasn't going to be long before it took place. Here it's going to be a few hundred years. And so it is to be sealed up, keep the vision secret. Now, as I said, I want to go back and emphasize verses 17 and 19 here and remind you before we get into the remainder of the book that we're talking about the time of the end. And the vision pertains to the time of the end in verse 17, pertains to the appointed time of the end in verse 19, and that appointed time of the end has something to do with the Grecian Empire, the fall of Alexander the Great, the rising up of these four kingdoms, the rise of Antiochus Epiphanes and his end. We're down at that period of time, and that's the time of the end. So somewhere before the end of Daniel, we're going to talk about what that time of the end is. And in our next study in Daniel chapter 9, I'm going to talk about that with regard to the vision of the weeks. I hope that you'll stay with us in this study, and particularly that you'll look at our next study on Daniel chapter 9. I think you'll find it quite enlightening with regard to the timeline of what God lays out and how He actually makes known the timing of when the fulfillment of these things is going to take place.